What happens when a HOA president tries to stage an arrest with fake police, only to realize the man she targeted is one of the most feared FBI agents in the country? Put your hands where I can see them. The voice was sharp, loud, and came from the mouth of a man in a tactical vest standing at the edge of Preston Aldridge's driveway. The words carried the weight of authority, but something about the tone was off, too rehearsed, too forced. Behind him, two other men in matching gear shifted nervously, their fake badges glinting under the late afternoon sun. And leading the entire scene was Claudine Hensley, the newly elected president of the Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association, her chin raised high, her eyes burning with a self-righteous fire. She pointed at Preston like she was delivering a sentence. "You are under arrest for repeated violations of our community codes. These men are here to enforce it." Neighbors froze in place. A boy holding a basketball stopped mid-dribble. A couple walking their dog slowed down, whispering to each other in disbelief. The neighborhood had seen Claudine's antics before, letters about lawn lengths, fines for leaving garbage bins out too long. But this was something else entirely. This was Claudine declaring herself judge, jury, and now, apparently, police. Preston Aldridge, a 43-year-old black man who had lived in the neighborhood for more than a decade, stood at the top of his porch steps in jeans and a simple t-shirt. His expression was calm, almost too calm for what was happening. He looked down at Claudine and then at the three men, trying hard to appear like law enforcement. He didn't flinch, didn't move back, didn't show an ounce of fear. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and said almost casually, "You want to run that by me again?" Claudine crossed her arms. "Don't play games, Preston. You've ignored notices, violated parking rules, and disrespected the community bylaws. The HOA is within its rights to enforce discipline." She gestured toward the men. "And these officers will take you into custody until the matter is resolved." Gasps slipped from a few neighbors who had edged closer, phones already pointed at the scene. The men in vests shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. Their patches didn't match. One carried a radio with no visible earpiece. Another had his badge hanging crookedly from Velcro, like it had been slapped on in a rush. Preston noticed all of it instantly. His training made details like that jump out, and though he hadn't said a word about who he really was, inside, he was already dissecting every flaw. These weren't officers, not even close. Still, he played along, tilting his head like a man humoring a bad joke. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his voice steady, "that the HOA has its own police force now?" Claudine lifted her chin higher. "Correct. And you're about to see what happens when someone thinks they're above the rules." One of the men cleared his throat. "Sir, we need you to come with us peacefully." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying nerves. Preston's lips curved into the smallest smile. Not friendly, not mocking, just the kind of smile someone wears when they've already figured out the ending to a story, but chooses to let the other characters catch up. He stepped down one stair, his phone in his hand now, the camera already recording. "Then show me your credentials," he said. The men froze. Claudine blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "They don't have to show you anything. I've authorized this." "You've authorized an arrest?" Preston asked, his tone sharper now. "With what legal authority?" The crowd of neighbors grew thicker, whispers rising like a chorus. Someone muttered, "She's lost it this time." Another said, "Are those even real cops?" Claudine turned toward the murmurs. "Quiet, all of you. This man is a danger to the community, and if you knew half of what he's done—" But Preston cut her off, his voice calm yet commanding. "No, Claudine. The only danger here is pretending you have power you don't." He panned his phone slowly over the three men. "And these gentlemen? They're impersonating law enforcement, which is a felony." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. A few neighbors gasped louder this time. The boy with the basketball dropped it, the echo bouncing down the street. Claudine's face flushed red, her confidence faltering for the first time. Still, she barked, "Don't listen to him. He's twisting the truth." Preston stayed where he was, phone still raised, his voice steady. Then let's make sure. I'll call the real police right now. The tension in that driveway was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Every neighbor leaned in, eyes darting between Claudine, the trembling fake officers, and Preston, who stood tall, composed, as if he had been waiting for this very moment all along. But what none of them realized yet was that Preston Aldridge wasn't just another homeowner. They were trying to intimidate one of the most feared FBI agents in the region. Long before Claudine Hensley marched up his driveway with her fake officers, Preston Aldridge had built a reputation that most men couldn't even dream of carrying. Not in his neighborhood, that part of his life was deliberately quiet, but in his career, his name meant something. Inside the bureau, people used to joke that when Aldridge entered an interrogation room, suspects would confess before he even sat down. It wasn't because he was loud or intimidating in the traditional sense. It was the way he carried himself, steady, controlled, like a man who already knew the answer to every question he asked. Preston grew up in Mobile, Alabama. His father worked nights at a shipping yard. His mother was a nurse. They didn't have much, but they gave him discipline, and they gave him perspective. He wasn't raised with a silver spoon, and maybe that's why he developed such a sharp instinct for spotting liars. He learned early that people don't always say what they mean, and what they don't say is often the most important detail of all. By the time he was in his 20s, Preston had joined the FBI. At first, it was field assignments in Florida, tracking fraud, investigating small organized crime rings, but his natural ability to keep calm in chaos pushed him up quickly. He became known for dismantling crews that other agents struggled with. Gang leaders, fraud masterminds, even a mid-level cartel network that had quietly been operating in Tampa, all fell apart under his watch. He wasn't flashy. He didn't care about headlines. His victories were quiet but definitive, the kind that left a mark on the people around him. Colleagues respected him, suspects feared him, and supervisors leaned on him when things got messy. But Preston wasn't just defined by his career. At home in Sarasota, he was a father, a husband, and eventually a widower raising his teenage son on his own after his wife passed from a sudden illness. He never let the bureau consume every part of him, but the job followed him everywhere. Even when he tried to live like any other man in Briarwood Estates, the instincts never left him. He could be grilling in the backyard, laughing with his son, and still notice a car circling the block too many times. So when Claudine and her fake officers stepped onto his property, Preston's mind didn't panic. It switched into assessment mode. He wasn't just a homeowner being threatened. He was an agent reading body language, tone, and details at lightning speed. The neighbors had never seen this side of him. To them, Preston was polite but private. He kept his lawn neat, waved when passing by, hosted his son's graduation barbecue 2 years ago. He wasn't the guy causing drama at HOA meetings or arguing about bylaws. If anything, most saw him as the type of neighbor you could count on to loan you a ladder or help with a heavy box. But Claudine saw him differently. She had targeted Preston for months, sending letters about minor violations that most people would ignore, calling him out in meetings over trivial things. Preston never escalated, never snapped. He handled it with silence, maybe a short reply, maybe no reply at all. To Claudine, that silence looked like defiance. She believed she had the upper hand. She believed Preston was passive. What she didn't know was that his silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And restraint was one of Preston's deadliest tools. The Bureau had taught him the value of patience. You don't always need to act immediately. Sometimes you wait, observe, and let people dig their own holes. That's exactly what Claudine was doing now, live in front of half the neighborhood. Preston's phone, still recording, caught everything. The fake badges, Claudine's shrill accusations, the trembling in the impostors' voices. Evidence was stacking up before the real authorities had even arrived. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved aggressively. He had simply let them reveal themselves. And yet, behind that calm exterior, Preston couldn't ignore what this moment really meant. This wasn't just about HOA bylaws or power-hungry leadership. It was about someone using the appearance of authority to intimidate, to scare, to humiliate. It was about 3 men willing to wear fake uniforms and threaten a resident in broad daylight. It was personal, and it was dangerous. The neighbors standing in that cul-de-sac couldn't know the full weight of what they were seeing. For them, it was shocking, outrageous, maybe even a little entertaining in the way that drama in suburban neighborhoods always is. But for Preston, every second was a calculation. How far would they go? Would the imposters actually try to force him into a vehicle? Would Claudine realize the line she had crossed? And still, he stayed calm. He stayed ready. Because that's what made Preston Aldridge different. But if Claudine thought she had embarrassed him into submission, she was about to realize just how wrong she was. Claudine Hensley wasn't born into power, but the way she clutched it now, you would think she had been waiting her entire life for the chance to control a neighborhood. People in Briarwood Estates had whispered about her long before she became HOA president. She had a reputation for inserting herself into every minor dispute, whether it was about parking, trash bins, or the shade of paint on someone's shutters. When the former president resigned last year, Claudine saw her opening. She ran unopposed, armed with speeches about protecting property values and restoring order. Some residents thought she sounded firm, others thought she sounded obsessive, but few actually wanted the responsibility of leading the HOA. So, by default, Claudine became the face of Briarwood Estates, and almost overnight, she transformed the HOA into her personal empire. Letters started appearing in mailboxes, warnings for leaving garden hoses out, fines for having basketball hoops visible from the street. One woman, Gloria Townsend, was threatened with legal action because her holiday lights stayed up a week past New Year's. Claudine relished these moments, speaking at HOA meetings with the kind of tone you might expect from a courtroom judge. Neighbors rolled their eyes, but most complied. It was easier to trim a hedge or repaint a mailbox than deal with Claudine's wrath. But Preston Aldridge wasn't like most neighbors. To Claudine, he was the ultimate challenge. He didn't respond to her letters with fear. He didn't beg for forgiveness at meetings. He didn't even seem rattled by her threats. When she told him his truck was parked half an inch over the driveway line, he looked at her calmly and said, "Then you're free to measure it again." That composure infuriated her. In her mind, Preston wasn't respecting her authority. He was mocking it. And that planted a seed of resentment that grew with every encounter. At first, Claudine doubled down with more notices. She accused him of breaking bylaws that didn't even exist, claims about improper landscaping, excessive noise, and disrupting the harmony of the community. Preston responded with the same quiet restraint. No shouting, no scenes, just calm dismissals that made her look unreasonable. The more composed he stayed, the more obsessed she became. By the time spring rolled around, Claudine was telling her inner circle that Preston was a danger to the neighborhood. She spun tales about him ignoring rules, intimidating residents, and acting like the HOA didn't apply to him. Some believed her, others didn't, but she spoke with such conviction that even skeptics hesitated to challenge her directly. Then came the fake police idea. It started small. Claudine began whispering that the HOA should have more serious enforcement, not just letters and fines, real consequences. At first, her friends brushed it off as her usual theatrics, but one evening at a dinner party in her kitchen, she revealed a plan. She had connections who could act as security officers for the community. She claimed it was legal. She claimed other neighborhoods were doing it. No one pressed her too hard. People had grown used to letting Claudine run wild with her schemes. The men she recruited weren't professionals. They weren't even trained. They were acquaintances, 2 of them from outside the neighborhood, 1 from a nearby gym she frequented. She convinced them that Preston was a threat, told them they would be serving the good of the community, and assured them she would handle the legal side. All they had to do was show up, wear tactical vests, and follow her lead. They believed her, or at least believed the money she offered was worth the stunt. What Claudine failed to realize was that she wasn't just playing a game of neighborhood politics anymore. She was stepping into criminal territory, and she was doing it against the wrong man. Her arrogance blinded her. In her head, this confrontation would cement her authority. Neighbors would see her standing tall with officers at her side. Preston would be humiliated, dragged away for everyone to witness. She imagined whispers turning into cheers, her name solidifying as the HOA president who cleaned up Briarwood Estates. But reality was already slipping out of her grasp. The men she called her officers were visibly nervous. Neighbors were recording. And Preston, quiet, calm Preston, was standing there like a man who had already seen this ending 1,000 times before. Claudine mistook his composure for weakness. She thought his calm meant submission. But in truth, that calm was the exact opposite. It was the silence before the storm, the patience of someone who had been trained his entire career to let arrogance write its own downfall. But the moment her fake officers tried to act, Claudine's fantasy of control would collide with the cold reality Preston was about to unleash. The men in tactical vests shifted nervously at the base of Preston Aldridge's driveway. From a distance, they might have looked official. Vests strapped tight, patches stitched on, radios clipped to their shoulders. But up close, the illusion was crumbling. The badges were cheap knockoffs, the vests mismatched, and their posture all wrong. They looked like actors in a poorly rehearsed play, and the audience, half the neighborhood, was already catching on. Claudine Hensley, standing tall with arms crossed, didn't see it. Or maybe she refused to. Her voice rose above the murmurs of neighbors as she snapped, "Take him into custody." One of the men hesitated. Ma'am." She cut him off. "Now." The tallest of the three stepped forward. His hand hovered awkwardly near a pair of plastic handcuffs strapped to his belt. "Sir, we need you to come with us." His tone was stiff, but the crack in his voice betrayed his nerves. Preston didn't move. He stood with his phone raised, calmly filming the entire scene. His eyes flicked over the man's vest. No official patches, no department logo. His badge, a thin piece of tin, reflected light, but carried none of the weight it was meant to. Preston had seen real agents, real officers. These men didn't measure up. "On whose authority?" Preston asked. His voice was even, not a hint of panic. "City, county, state?" The man faltered. His eyes darted to Claudine for help. "Don't answer him," Claudine snapped. "You don't owe him an explanation." Preston lowered his phone slightly, giving her a sharp look. "If they're real officers, Claudine, they're required to identify themselves. So go ahead, show me the ID. Let's make it clear for everyone here." He gestured toward the growing crowd. At least a dozen neighbors had gathered, phones raised, capturing every second. Claudine's jaw tightened. "You're not in control here, Preston." But the problem was, he was. The tallest imposter stepped closer, fumbling with his words. "Sir, don't make this harder. If you just..." "Don't touch me." Preston's voice cut like steel. He didn't raise it, but the authority in his tone made the man pause mid-step. "You put a hand on me without proper identification, and you're committing a crime. And I promise you, law enforcement will treat it as such." The crowd reacted instantly. Low gasps, someone whispering, "He's right," another muttering, "This is crazy." Claudine's face turned crimson. She waved her hand toward the men. "Ignore him! Arrest him! That's an order!" Preston let out a short laugh, not mocking, just incredulous. He turned his phone back toward her. "Listen to yourself. That's an order? Claudine, you run an HOA, not the Department of Justice. You fine people for weeds. You don't arrest them." Her eyes darted around, realizing how many neighbors were recording, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "He's dangerous. You don't know who you're living next to. He thinks he's above the rules, and today he's going to learn he's not." Preston's voice dropped, calm but firm. "You're right about one thing. You don't know who you're living next to." The impostors shifted again. One rubbed the back of his neck. The radio clipped to his vest, falling silent. It wasn't even switched on. The second man looked toward the street, like he was debating whether to bolt. Their confidence was draining by the second. Preston spotted every tell. He stepped down another stair, still filming. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand right there until the real police arrive. You're going to hand over those fake badges. And you're going to explain to them why you were pretending to be something you're not. Because what you're doing right now, that's a felony. Claudine barked. Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you. Do your job. The tallest impostor's voice cracked. Ma'am, I don't think this is a good idea anymore. Claudine whipped toward him, her finger stabbing the air. You do what I tell you, or I'll make sure you regret it. Her words only deepened the silence in the crowd. A neighbor's voice rang out clearly now. She's out of her mind. Preston held the camera steady on her face, his tone cutting. Keep talking, Claudine. Every word you say right now is evidence. For the first time, she looked rattled. Her bravado wavered as she realized Preston wasn't intimidated, the men weren't following orders, and the neighbors weren't siding with her. The performance she imagined, her standing as the authority of Briarwood Estates, was unraveling in real time. The fake officers stood frozen, caught between Claudine's shouting and Preston's calm dismantling of their act. The neighbors were no longer passive. They were openly questioning her, some even laughing in disbelief. And Preston? He was still steady, still filming, still in control. But the real turning point hadn't come yet, because Preston was about to show Claudine and everyone else exactly who they were trying to mess with. Preston Aldridge had spent his entire career training for moments when chaos hit its peak. And here it was, his HOA president shouting at the top of her lungs, 3 imposters standing on his driveway pretending to be law enforcement, and half the neighborhood glued to their phones like they were front-row witnesses to a scandal. But unlike most people, Preston didn't panic. He saw angles, he saw mistakes, he saw leverage. He took one more step down the porch, his phone steady in his hand. The camera lens caught every twitch in Claudine's face, every nervous shuffle of her so-called officers, and every gasp from the neighbors across the street. You want to arrest me, he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone gathered. Then read me my rights. Go on, I'm waiting. The imposters froze. One looked at the other, eyes wide, silently pleading for backup. Not one of them spoke. Go ahead, Preston pressed. His tone didn't rise, but it sharpened. Miranda rights, word for word. If you're real officers, this is basic procedure. The silence stretched long enough for the neighbors to start whispering. Someone laughed under their breath. Another neighbor muttered, They don't even know them. The tallest imposter stammered, You have the right. He stopped mid-sentence, fumbling, and shook his head. Preston lowered his phone just enough to look him directly in the eye. Exactly. He lifted the phone again, panning slowly back toward Claudine. Her face was red, sweat forming at her temples. Still, she pushed forward. This is irrelevant. The HOA doesn't operate under Miranda rights. Stop stalling, Preston. These men are here to enforce the rules, and you're violating them. Preston tilted his head slightly. Then let me explain something. I've worked with real federal officers for more than 20 years. I know exactly what law enforcement looks like, what procedures they follow, what authority they have. These men? They're not it. They're criminals impersonating officers, which, last I checked, carries a maximum sentence of 3 years in federal prison. That landed like a punch. Claudine's mouth opened, but no words came out. The imposters exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered something under his breath, too quiet for the crowd to hear, but Preston caught it. We need to get out of here. He didn't give them the chance. He tapped his phone screen, speaking clearly now. Dispatch, this is Special Agent Preston Aldridge, badge number 44721. I need a patrol unit at Briarwood Estates immediately. 3 individuals are impersonating law enforcement officers. The crowd erupted in gasps. A ripple of shock moved through the neighbors as they turned to one another, piecing together what they had just heard. Preston hadn't said it for drama. He said it because it was protocol, but the effect was electric. Wait, did he say FBI? Someone whispered. Another neighbor, an older man holding his phone high, said louder, He's an agent. Oh my God, he's FBI. The imposters stiffened. The tallest one muttered, What the hell did we walk into? Claudine, realizing the control was slipping from her grip, tried one last time to spin the narrative. She waved her arms, shouting, "Don't listen to him. He's lying. He's manipulating all of you." But no one believed her anymore. The neighbors had seen enough. Preston stepped fully off his porch now, standing squarely in front of the men. He didn't raise his fists, didn't posture. He simply stared them down with the kind of authority that didn't come from a vest or a badge. It came from years of facing down real threats. "You have two choices," he said evenly. "Stand here quietly until the police arrive, or add resisting arrest to your list of charges. Your call." The impostors froze, torn between fear of Claudine's orders and the quiet power radiating from Preston. The neighbors were watching too closely for them to make a move. Claudine's voice cracked as she screamed, "Do something! Don't just stand there!" But the men didn't move. They couldn't. Her power was gone, stripped away in a matter of minutes by the very man she thought she could humiliate. And as Preston stood there, phone still rolling, neighbors realized they weren't just watching a neighborhood spat anymore. They were witnessing a showdown between arrogance and truth, between false authority and the real thing. But the real storm was only beginning, because the moment the police sirens echoed down Briarwood Drive, everything shifted for good. The sound of sirens carried down Briarwood Drive like a warning bell. Heads turned, phones lifted higher, and the imposters' faces drained of color. The flashing lights drew closer, reflecting off windows and cars, until finally two squad vehicles pulled up and parked at the curb. The officers stepped out quickly, real uniforms, real badges, real authority in their movements. You didn't need to be trained to see the difference. Even the neighbors who had been skeptical up to this point could feel the shift in energy. This was the moment where play acting collided with reality. Preston lowered his phone just enough to address them. "Officers, I've been recording the entire interaction. These three individuals presented themselves as law enforcement under the authority of the HOA president. They attempted to arrest me without cause. Their credentials are fake." The taller imposter's lips moved as if he wanted to explain, but no words came out. The shorter one took half a step back before an officer raised a hand. "Don't move. Hands where we can see them." Within seconds, the three men were being separated, their fake badges confiscated, radios checked, and found to be nothing more than glorified walkie-talkies. The plastic cuffs, dangling from their belts, suddenly looked ridiculous, like props in a costume store. Claudine Hensley stormed forward, her voice shrill. "Wait, this is a mistake. They were hired by the HOA. They're here under my authority." One of the officers turned toward her with a puzzled expression. "Your authority? Ma'am, unless you're law enforcement or acting under direct orders from the state, you don't have the legal right to detain anyone." Claudine lifted her chin, trying to hold on to the confidence that had carried her this far. "I'm the HOA president. That gives me responsibility for the safety of this community." The officer shook his head. "That doesn't give you the right to impersonate law enforcement or to authorize others to do it." Murmurs spread through the crowd of neighbors. Phones captured every second, every word, and Claudine's credibility was crumbling faster than she could defend it. Preston, still calm, spoke evenly. "Check the recordings. You'll hear her giving the order for them to take me into custody. You'll hear her claim they were HOA enforcement officers." One officer nodded. "We'll be taking statements." The imposters were handcuffed, real handcuffs this time, and placed against the squad cars. Their earlier swagger had vanished, replaced with shame and quiet panic. Claudine rushed toward the nearest officer. No, you don't understand. This is all being blown out of proportion. He's twisting things. Preston has been difficult since the day he moved in." That line didn't land the way she hoped. Instead of support, the neighbors reacted with visible disgust. One woman shouted from the sidewalk, "We've lived next to him for years, Claudine. He's never been a problem. You are." Another neighbor chimed in, "You've gone too far. Way too far." Claudine spun, her face pale but still defiant. "I was trying to protect property values, to keep order." Preston finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "Order doesn't come from lies, Claudine. It doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from respect. And right now, you've lost every ounce of it." That hit harder than any insult could. Claudine faltered, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the moment sank in. Her officers were cuffed. The real police were documenting everything, and the neighbors, her supposed subjects, were staring at her not with admiration, but with contempt. The officers finished taking Preston's statement, noting his credentials as an FBI agent. That revelation alone shifted the crowd's perception into something deeper than just neighborhood drama. They realized Claudine hadn't just picked on a quiet homeowner. She had staged a confrontation with someone who knew the law inside and out, someone who dismantled criminal operations for a living. As the squad cars prepared to leave with the impostors in custody, Claudine tried one last desperate attempt. She pointed at Preston, her voice hoarse. "This isn't over. You'll regret embarrassing me like this." Preston raised his phone one final time, recording her words. "Threats won't save you now, Claudine. They'll only dig the hole deeper." The officers warned her to stop interfering and made it clear that an investigation into her role in organizing the stunt would follow. The look on her face, half shock, half denial, was captured by at least 5 phones in the crowd. By nightfall, that image would be online, shared and reshared, with captions that painted her not as a protector of property values, but as a power-hungry president who had crossed a line she could never come back from. Neighbors slowly dispersed, shaking their heads, some muttering disbelief. A few walked over to Preston, thanking him for keeping calm, for standing his ground. He didn't smile, didn't brag. He just nodded and said, "I only did what anyone should do when faced with lies." But deep down, Preston knew this wasn't just about him and Claudine. The fallout would ripple through Briarwood Estates, dividing neighbors, raising questions, and forcing everyone to rethink what power really meant in their community. By the following morning, Briarwood Estates was no longer the quiet Florida neighborhood it had been the week before. Video clips from Preston's driveway were circulating across social media. Some were only a few seconds long, just enough to capture Claudine barking orders at her fake officers or Preston calmly asking for their IDs. Others showed the police arriving, neighbors gasping, and Claudine's final outburst caught in crystal clarity. "You'll regret embarrassing me like this." The comments online were merciless. Some mocked the men in their mismatched vests, calling them dollar store cops. Others criticized Claudine directly, calling her a danger to her community. And yet, a smaller group argued in her defense, claiming she had only been trying to keep order in her neighborhood, but inside Briarwood Estates, the divide was sharper. Some neighbors couldn't look at Claudine without shaking their heads. At least 3 families openly said they would be petitioning for her removal from the HOA board. Others were quieter, embarrassed they had ever supported her, avoiding conversation altogether. For Preston, it was different. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, and he certainly didn't want it. His career in the FBI had taught him to keep his personal life away from the spotlight. Now, for the first time, his neighbors were looking at him differently, not just as the quiet man who kept his lawn trimmed and waved politely, but as someone who carried authority they hadn't realized was right in front of them all along. He sat on his porch that evening, a cup of coffee in hand, when Gloria Townsend, the neighbor Claudine had once threatened over holiday lights, walked over. She was hesitant at first, but finally said, "Preston, I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did yesterday, but for showing everyone what she's really capable of." Preston shook his head. "Don't thank me. I didn't expose her. She exposed herself. All I did was stand there and tell the truth." Her eyes softened. "Maybe so. But if you hadn't stayed calm, if you hadn't handled it the way you did, who knows how far she would have gone?" That was the part that stuck with Preston most. The how far. He had dealt with dangerous people before, men who carried guns, men who built entire criminal empires. Claudine wasn't like them, but the principle was the same. People who get a taste of power often want more, and when no one challenges them, they push further and further until someone draws the line. This time, that someone had been him. Days later, at the HOA meeting, the tension was unbearable. Claudine sat at the head of the table, her face pale, the confidence that once carried her speeches nowhere to be found. Dozens of residents filled the room, many of them clutching copies of the petition demanding her removal. The very neighbors she once silenced with threats of fines were now speaking louder than ever. One man stood and said firmly, "We all saw what happened. She tried to turn this place into her own little kingdom, and she put the safety of this community at risk. That isn't leadership." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the room. Claudine tried to interject, but her voice was drowned out. She wasn't in control anymore. Preston didn't say much at that meeting. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to remind everyone of what had happened. When it was over, the vote wasn't even close. Claudine was removed as president. She stormed out of the room without looking at anyone. Outside, neighbors approached Preston again. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others admitted they had been afraid of Claudine. Preston listened quietly, then offered a single reminder. Silence is what gives people like her power. If you see someone abusing authority, speak up. Don't wait until it goes too far. That was the lesson Briarwood Estates carried forward. Not that their neighbor was an FBI agent. Not that Claudine had crossed the line so dramatically. But that false authority only works if people let it. Respect is earned, not demanded, and real order can't come from fear. The videos continued spreading online for weeks, sparking debates across the country about HOAs, racial bias, and the dangers of impersonating law enforcement. But for the residents of Briarwood Estates, the message was personal. They had watched arrogance crumble, and they had watched calm strength hold firm. On his porch, Preston finally let himself relax. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues at the bureau, some congratulating him, others teasing him for going viral. He smiled faintly but didn't reply right away. His son sat beside him, asking, "Dad, do you ever get tired of being the calmest person in the room?" Preston chuckled. "Sometimes, but staying calm is what keeps the truth clear. If you lose your head, you lose control. And when you lose control, people like Claudine win." His son nodded slowly, understanding more than words could explain. The neighborhood was quieter now, the threat gone, but the lesson permanent. Abuse of power doesn't always wear a uniform, and fear doesn't have to be loud to control people. But respect, true respect, only survives when people stand up for it. And Preston Aldridge, without shouting, without swinging a fist, had reminded everyone of that. So if there's one thing to carry from